The most dangerous? Well, my friends, there is a US military base in Portugal, if you are not aware. Okay, we're going to this. The most dangerous US military bases around the world. My friends, I really wonder what those are. But before I go into that, let me ask you for one thing. If you can leave a like, thank you so much. Is the best way to show support. Now, if you can subscribe, well, in that case, forget about it. You make my day. Have that in consideration. Link for the original video in my description, and let's play it.
Whether you support the US military's expansion or not, its presence around the world is felt by millions, and
It's everywhere.
its foreign base count exceeds that of any known empire in world history. So why does the US military have bases everywhere? In order to
That's actually a great question.
understand how we got where we are today, we need to know where we began. As a fledgling nation, forts were the first thing a US citizen saw when acquiring a new territory, often preceding neighborhoods and local government. The Founding Fathers understood that this new civilization would collapse if unprotected. In the beginning, the US established outposts.
Let me say one thing, but the more I learn about American history, the more I admire the Founding Fathers, my friends, because they end up being genius almost.
Would collapse if unprotected. In the beginning, the US established outposts like Jefferson Barracks in 1826 and naval yards in locations like Boston, Brooklyn, and Philadelphia. In the 19th century, the US territory was so vast that it started to resemble a large confederation of small countries, prompting the governments to lay out bases strategically to ensure domestic stability in all developing regions.
Okay, to be fair here, my friends, I look at America, I know it's just one country, but to me it's like 50 countries because the states are so massive.
By 1862, internal base growth had reached an all-time high, with conflicts like the Plains Indian Wars and the Mexican Cession leading to the creation of key military strongholds, such as Fort Sill in Oklahoma, Fort Sam Houston in Texas, and Fort Riley in Kansas. Soon after that, the Spanish-American War of 1898 was the first conflict that sent the US down the path to becoming an overseas empire. At the close of the war, the Treaty of Paris led to the acquisition of the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico as American territories. Prior to this, Congress
See, but the Puerto Rico thing, Puerto Rico is not a state. No, I'm sure it's not a state. But why is not a state? You know, because I believe America protects Puerto Rico when it comes to the military, right?
was hesitant.
Maybe I'm off on this, but at least I have that idea.
Guam and Puerto Rico as American territories. Prior to this, Congress was hesitant to pump money into foreign settlements of any kind, primarily focusing the military on establishing order in the states. Because of this, almost 50% of the United States' 200,000-man army was made up of National Guard units. The artillery count was low, and naval presence was equal to or less than what was found in
What the hell? Okay, so back in the day, America was behind.
countries like England,
Okay, this is about to go crazy.
Germany, or France. Hypothetically, if two of the three decided to target the East Coast, the US would have been in a lot of trouble, and most likely would have turned into another failed democratic experiment.
Europe uses to be strong.
However, the right
Man, back in the day, my friends, now America is number one by far.
rising conflict with Spanish generals like General Valeriano Weyler compelled this growing economic superpower to build its first permanent series of bases in Cuba, Hawaii, Guam, and the Panama Canal Zone at the start of the 20th century. With this, more trade routes were facilitated with Western allies. The United
Makes
States
sense.
was becoming a very rich country, and it became apparent that measures had to be taken to sustain that. By World War I, the US was laying the groundwork to become one of the world's most fortified nation-states domestically as well, putting up bases like Fort Benning in Georgia and Fort Bragg in North Carolina, both of which would become two of the largest training centers in the country. The focus was inward, not outward, a concept that the new generation would have a hard time believing, a US determined to avoid intervention at any cost. It's important to understand that up until the late 1930s, a vast majority of the United States was composed of isolationists, meaning that they preferred to only involve themselves economically. There was a history of funneling resources for future financial benefit, but putting boots on the ground was considered to be excessive. Instead, the country continued to fortify itself with bases planted in San Diego, Los Angeles, and Pearl Harbor.
So it's kind of crazy to know that, because America is so rich right now and is the number one country in the world because of World War I and World War II, right? Since Europe ended up getting totally destroyed and America ended up winning the war, and the soil was perfect, you know what I mean?
Last one would eventually act as a gateway to the global fortification we see today. Now, compare that to the 57 territories, colonies, and dominions that the British Empire held at the same period, managing 20% of the world's populace. The world was a much different place. By 19...
If you guys are not aware, I knew this, that the British Empire was crazy. But if we go even, back in history, you guys will see that Portugal and Spain also had crazy empires.
Of the world's populace. The world was a much different place. By 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had settled negotiations with England in what would come to be known as the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. If the Spanish-American War and World War I were sparks that started widespread base construction, consider this piece of legislation a tub full of kerosene. This was the first real mass expansion, with the US receiving 99-year leases to 8 British air and naval bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda, British Guiana, and 5 key Caribbean islands. Not only did this establish a long tradition of weapons trading, with the US sending 50 destroyers across the sea, but it also set the tone for the rest of the Great War and beyond. Naval superiority was paramount during World War II. Although the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to surrender its U-boats, Adolf Hitler approved craft construction in 1935. In a matter of months, submarine warfare had become a ubiquitous concern for the Allies. During the war, a total of 1,162 U-boats were built to strike at a moment's notice. It was now more important than ever for countries with resources to spare to start assisting nations that had already exhausted themselves. Seizing the opportunity, the US procured basing rights in Brazil, Morocco, Azores, Iceland, and...
Oh, wait a second! Azores, we say Azores, is an island in Portugal.
The US procured basing rights in Brazil, Morocco, Azores,
right there,
Iceland, and Great Britain in an effort to stave off the onslaught of submersibles coming from...
Sorry, fun fact, a lot of immigrants that go from Portugal to America come from that island, Azores.
The Axis powers.
Why I'm saying Azores? I should say the way we say it here, Azores.
These new bases would act as stable checkpoints in the Atlantic, as sending supplies to Great Britain and the Soviet Union had become extremely difficult. At this point, many were destitute, and US assistance was the only thing keeping friendly forces afloat. In the heat of battle, these new bases served multiple purposes that Allies welcomed. Over in the Pacific, Japan was an absolute force, taking the Philippines, Dutch East Indies, New Guinea, Guam, and many more vital havens. Although not as...
Friends, I love history, as you guys are aware, and I was studying World of War II the other day, and man, we talk about Japan nowadays, but Japan was basically the equivalent of Germany in World War II. They thought they could conquer the world, specific all the Asian countries. But America had different plans.
As effective as the Germans, they managed to sink 1 million tons of Allied merchant ship material in the supply chain. The US reacted quickly, establishing more bases for infantry and bombing expeditions in Australia, New Zealand, Britain, North Africa, Italy, China, and some Pacific islands. At this point, the US, as well as the rest of the Allied forces, were dealing with a logistical nightmare. It was no easy feat building bases to support and train more than 11 million men. With such limitations, rampant construction became an
11 million men. We are 10 million in Portugal. Why am I doing the Portugal versus America comparisons? I don't know, but I love both countries, so that is that.
An absolute necessity. It was also the beginning of joint bases, where allies would share the burden of protecting posts necessary for when the time was right to fight back. This is how the US found its way into being the economic boon of the world. When the Axis powers were finally eliminated on September 2, 1945, the Allies found themselves with a unique opportunity. In a sense, civilization had to be rebuilt. The only problem was that the new leaders of the world had different visions for what this new civilization would look like. When Great Britain, France, the US, and the Soviet Union sat down to disperse the spoils of war, they were effectively establishing the New World Order. They started by carving up Germany into 4 occupation zones.
Sorry, but that's a crazy photo. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. Holy...
New World Order. They started by carving up Germany into 4 occupation zones to be controlled by the 4 main victors. Immediately, it was clear that the Russians had big plans for Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and many other parts of the manageable territory nearest to them. During the war, many nations like Yugoslavia were proposed.
To put things in a easier way, communism and capitalism both fought the Nazis, but now they also hate each other. It's kind of fascinating.
Opponents of communism, but not formally part of the Soviet expansion project. However, as time went on, it was clear who commanded the New East. As the final bit of dust settled in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the Russian military presence was on the decline, but not enough for Western comfort. Even as men returned home.
Sorry, I'm pausing too much today, and this video is not about, I guess, World War II, but it's interesting because when they dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they made the Japanese emperor speak. I could be wrong on this, don't fact check me, but I believe until this day, the Japanese people thought that the emperor was some type of god. But America made the Japanese emperor speak to the nation by radio. And for a lot of people, that was the first time they end up hearing the voice of the emperor. And after that, they end up realizing he is not a god.
It was documented that the West was still outnumbered 10-1.
It's a crazy story.
The US was in yet another...
Oh my god. What?
Unique position. While it was clearly the new leader of the West, being on the top meant that defense was now the primary responsibility. News was circulating around Washington that the Russians could summon 8 million war-hardened troops within the span of a month. On March 5, 1946, Churchill would give a speech detailing the new threat to Westminster College in Fulton. The Iron Curtain was raised and the Cold War had officially begun. The US was setting world records at this point, building an average of 112 foreign military installations per month. As arguably well-founded paranoia peaked amongst the new superpowers, war was thought to be an inevitability, and much of the militaristic elite believed that a key point of vulnerability was the Fulda Gap, which sat in the middle of East and West Germany, a point that led directly from Russian territory into France and the English Channel.
So is this about the Berlin Wall?
Concerns of this nature would surface over the next decade, leading to a need for immediate deployment in the wake of a Red invasion. Thus began what many would eventually refer to as the policy of deterrence. It wasn't enough to simply warn the opponent anymore. Something had to be done. Before these events, military growth was usually reactionary. When an imminent threat loomed, it was time to call on the laboring men of your country and neighbors to fortify for God and country. Now it was seen as a necessary constant, an insurance policy for the inevitable radioactive tempest that could tear through the capitalist half of Europe. Newly formed governments strapped for cash, especially in West Germany, all but begged for US base and embassy construction. At the height of the Cold War, the US had over 200 military installations across Germany's border wall alone. These countries bordering to or connected to the Soviets believed that a US military presence would do for their country what gold once did for fiat currency. When the barbarians were at the gates, they could call on the legions to preserve the Western legacy. The need was no different in East Asia. The following decades saw war break out in Korea and a strengthening alliance with Japan. The U.S. Air Force's Strategic Air Command, or SAC, bumped the bomber base count up from 19 to 30. At this point, the objective was to secure as much territory as possible. Most believed that war could spell the death of millions of civilians and possibly total Armageddon. Bases were constructed in Greenland, Libya, England, Spain, Morocco, Korea, and the Philippines. That said, as the Soviets enhanced their missile defense, much of these launch zones became obsolete. By 1965, base count had ballooned from the Vietnam War, leading to major projects in Okinawa, Guam, and Luzon. This activity would eventually be referred to as the Empire of Bases strategy. Approaching the 21st century, the US-British interest in oil was at an all-time high. Little did they know that an opportunity would seemingly fall from the sky. On August 2, 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. They owed their neighbor quite a bit of
free oil
money, and Kuwait's oil reserves were considered the ultimate prize. This invasion triggered a wave of military installations along the Persian Gulf, supported by a coalition of 42 other countries. Over time, the increasing base number proved to be useful
So having the military bases there, it was the perfect opportunity, right? So I was trying to not pause too much because this guy is doing a great job.
not vital during operations like Desert Shield and Desert Storm. This is where base building had hit its absolute peak, but the end of the Cold War in the 1990s would cause many to question the need for US involvement. It was clear which country had become the next empire, and global outcry for the dismantling of military installations was also at an all-time high. At this point, the general opinion was that the global giant was overstaying its welcome. However, while some base removal was quick and easy, like the withdrawal from Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines,
to be fair, the amount of money that America needs to put into all of this is... I mean, that's why you guys spend billions, right? Soon, I feel like trillions. Looking at year by year is increasing, right? So it's a question of time until it's trillions.
or Subic Bay, others like Okinawa would prove difficult. It became
Not trillions, a trillion.
clear that the golden age of US base building was coming to an end. The question was how many were to remain, as some locations served and continue to serve as trade route security. Today, the US has more than halved their military installation count, bringing it down from about 1,600 to 750 in 2022,
really?
or so the record states. As the demand for base removal has increased in recent decades, the number might continue to drop. There are a fair number of abandoned US military installations.
It's kind of funny that the guy is... Not funny, but it's kind of interesting that the guy is saying this, because I was reading, this was a couple of months ago, that the US military base in Portugal is very inactive and maybe is about to get closed or something.
That have become the subject of discussion all over the internet. Some examples include the Monsell forts built in Thames and Mersey to protect the UK in World War II, Kalama Atoll built to store chemical weapons, and California's Sassoon Bay, housing what's been dubbed as the Ghost Ship Fleet. The abandonment of these bases has led to a variety of developments, and many of them have been less than positive. From the ghost ship fleet contaminating the water to waste leaks in Greenland, the exodus has often been problematic for the environment. Also, there are cases where abandoned bases are transferred over to hostile entities like the Taliban, when the US pulled forces in that fateful July of 2021.
Friends, what the hell happened? Because America ended up leaving Afghanistan, but from what I understand, it was a huge disaster. But why would America do that, you know? Because every time I think about the US military, I mean, we are talking about the best minds in the world when it comes to war, you know? So surprises me that they did that mistake.
In truth, bases have been turned over or destroyed since the 1950s, but it's hard to determine how this makes a big difference, considering that they have started to build many more in recent years. Some are quick to draw a parallel between the British Empire and the proliferation of US bases, explaining that some of these territories are essentially British dominions with a different label. The belief is that the two nations passed the torch at the end of World War II. It's important to to point out that Great Britain still has 145 bases spread out over 42 countries. China
That's a lot.
has plenty, but most of them are within the bounds of aggressive
In Asia,
annexation, and Russia holds 21 notable stations. Many are in Balkan and Slavic territories. This is an interesting way to frame the dynamic, but the situation appears to be a bit more gray. Although the US reportedly reduced base count, the number of countries that host US bases have doubled from 40.
But to be fair, US, UK, and France. Okay, is a UK military. Is a France. Is a UK based military. Is a France based military. It's the same as saying is a US military at the end of the day, because if things go wrong, even though right now there is some tension between Europe and America, I still think we are the best allies possible.
To 80 countries over the last 3 decades. This suggests that base construction has become more organized, meaning that fewer bases are required to reach the same objectives. That, or maybe things aren't as organized as we once thought. When thinking about the future base count in the United States, there are 3 main factors that will inevitably play a key role: public opinion, economic security, and government transparency. At the moment, defensive realism appears to be the preferred trend in the American mind. Living costs continue to rise, and Congress is beginning to resist giving as much aid to places of conflict.
My friend, this video I believe was 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. So feel free to share your perspective on this right now,
Are increases in reports from densely populated areas regarding a lack of health and safety. If the American people have greater domestic...
Actually, sorry, I'm not sure. Maybe I know this video is not up to date, but maybe it's just 1 year old. That said, it's still a bit old. So do you think things end up changing with Trump entering the White House, or things are still more or less the same?
Areas regarding a lack of health and safety. If the American people have greater domestic interests, there's a chance that the tide would shift in the other direction. Maybe we'll start to see more base development in the States to deal with the rise in public unrest like in the early 20th century. Leadership and party objectives would inevitably play a role. That said, money talks. Finance will always play a role on the world stage. Ever since Nixon's decision to abandon the gold standard, the US dollar has become a questionable default currency for the rest of the world. Now called the de-dollarization movement, this retaliation towards the US has come with its fair share of challenges. For the uninitiated, overseas trade routes may seem like a small concern, but there are pathways that would completely cripple the US economy if blocked. An example of this would be Djibouti, a country sitting across from Yemen separated by the Bab al-Mandab Strait. This 28-kilometer wide pathway is the only way to get from the Red Sea to the Gulf.
Ooh, so this is good for the... Wait, sorry, did I... Okay, Djibouti. Oh, this is not a US military base. Is this a country? Sorry.
Djibouti, a country sitting across from Yemen separated by the Bab
al... I thought if this was a US military base, it would be important to fight the Houthis and stuff like that.
Mandab Strait.
And if Iran eventually goes to war with America.
This 28-kilometer wide pathway is the only way to get from the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, and is second to the Suez Canal for transporting valuable resources, specifically oil. Meaning, if this route were to be taken away, an almost incalculable amount of wealth would be lost. For this reason, it's a hotspot for bases belonging to both sides of the aisle, including the US, Italy, China, France, and Japan.
They are all there apart from Russia.
The US will never give up their base at the capital or any other profitable locations. This brings us to the issue of transparency. The truth is, we probably will never know exactly how many bases exist. The 21st century has revealed that the US government isn't too keen on sharing information. Plus, even if subjected to an audit, they find ways to satisfy public inquiry if they don't have a clear answer.
So they are lying to us?
From the occasional leak, much of the citizenry feels like they're left in the dark when it comes to foreign operations. Just recently, the Pentagon used author David Vine's database to share how many foreign bases are currently active. This either means that the government can't keep track of how many bases are established across the
don't
globe,
know.
or they use these records in order to save themselves the burden of scrubbing bases from their own personal
They know. They probably is more than they would like to share, I feel like.
records. All in all, it's probably a safe bet that the US will continue to pay or force their way into base building deals. If diplomacy continues to fail, a military presence appears to be the country's best bet for maintaining order. Construction will most likely increase in both domestic and foreign territory to manage the populace here and abroad.
Okay, my friends, thank you so much for watching this with me. This was a great video. Man, it's kind of scary to think that maybe they are at all-time high in terms of US militaries, but we basically don't know. So I have no idea. My friends, tell me what you think about this. It's a really interesting topic, and for sure, America military bases makes America very strong when it comes to war. But yeah, see you guys in the next one. Bye, my friends.